Hi. I'm Eleonora, and today I'm going to talk about this research that I did with my co-workers Thomas Brohagen, Andres Medebach, and Gemma Boleda. So the topic of our research are object names. And when we say object, we mean stuff like this one here. So in our dataset that is called the many names dataset, we have real-world images with objects highlighted with a red bounding box. And then we have many speakers that produce a name for the object. In this case, we can see that 34 speakers produce the name giraffe. In our dataset, we also have objects like this one on the left. So in this case, we can see that many speakers produce a different name. And so there is much more naming variation. So our research question in this work was why? Why we have so much naming variation for an object like this one with respect to an object like this one here. So previous work about naming used stimuli like this one. So this is like a simplistic version of objects that were drawings. Sometimes there, like people used also colored version of this, but in general, the idea here was to use stimuli that were as prototypical as possible. That was really the purpose. Instead, in our case, we're going to work with objects like this one. So as we said, these are real world images. So we have also a real context that here was absent. And this allows us to like try to model human naming behavior in a bit more realistic way. So the question is, which are the sources of naming variation? And in particular, we're going to check how naming variation is affected by visual typicality on the one side and lexical frequency on the other side. And in particular, we are going to study two aspects of visual typicality. One is object typicality, and the other one is context typicality. So another thing that we have to talk about is how to measure typicality. So previous work usually use subjective ratings of typicality. So speakers were asked to give a score for how closely an object resembled the mental image of that category. Instead, in our work, we're going to use a computational measure for it so that we have a larger scale study and easily scalable. So we are going to use a computer vision model. So computer vision models process images, and what they give you is a vector that has high-level visual features encoded. This means that when you process an object, a picture, you get a vector that is multidimensional, and you can put it in a visual space. So in our case, we have 2048 dimensions, but let's imagine we have only two. So we have processed two images, and we obtain vectors that we can place in this space. And for example, we had these two dogs, and we obtained two vectors, and this is the position that they take in the space. So to assess the object and the context typicality, what we do is to compute a prototype. For example, in this case, the prototype of the object dog. So to do so, we take a lot of objects named dog in another data set. We average their visual vector, and what we obtain is a thing like this. So we can say that the object here is closer to the prototype, so it is more typical than this object here that is a toy dog and is far away from the prototype, and it's very atypical. We're going to use a similar strategy for context as well. So for context, we mean the global scene that is around the target object. We can see that this dog appears in a very typical context that is a park. This is in a toy store, so it's not very typical. So we are going to process with the computer vision model also our context. And this means that we to visualize this, we are not taking the information from the area of the target object. And then we compute a prototype of the context for dog by averaging many representations of dog images and their context. And then we are going to say that this park is closer to the prototype of context for dog than this one. So this is more atypical. So what we end up having in the end is a space of object prototypes. This is the two-dimensional reduction of our space. And we are plotting here individual prototypes. So we can see that we have nice semantic properties maintained. For example, here we can see that all these dots represent prototypes from the domain food. Here we have home prototypes, and here we have a people domain. So we can see that, for example, this one is pizza, this is bread, this is biscuits. So we know that things that are visually very similar are clustered together in the space. And we have a similar structure also for the context prototypes, but also different because the shape of the context visual space is different. It is smaller in general. And we can see a nice property here that is that buildings and vehicles get clustered together because they tend to appear in the same scenes. And this is nice. So we are going to use this space to test our hypothesis. So the plan of our analysis was to predict naming variation. And to measure variation, we are going to use entropy. This is a measure that just expresses the fact that this object has received more different names by many different people, while this one has no variation. And to do this analysis, we're going to use the many names dataset that I mentioned before. This has 25K images, but we're going to work on a data subset that is the objects that have at least 2 names. This is 16,000. And we are going to talk about top name, that is the name that has been used by the majority of the notators. In this case, it's woman. And the alternative names are all the other names in the list. But we are going to use for this analysis only the first one, so the first alternative name that we're going to call the alternative name. So the plan of our analysis is to predict variation based on 3 predictors. We have object typicality for top name and alternative name, context typicality for top name and alternative name, and lexical frequency for top name and alternative name. So talking about our hypothesis, if we look at an object like this one, we know that she's a pretty typical woman and that she's holding a racket. So she's not actively playing tennis. So we can think that maybe some annotators say tennis player, but not a lot, because she's not really prototypical for a tennis player. And we can see this reflected in the names that she receives. So 30 people produced woman, while only 3 produced tennis player. This is different from what happens here in this case. So she is actively playing tennis, so she's really a typical tennis player, and we can see this in the names that people produce for her. Okay, so we can see that 17 people produce woman, but many people produce something related to playing. And since we were talking about gender bias, a master student of ours ran an analysis, and she noticed that sport name related to sport are also produced less often in case of women. So this is another variable that is at play. But in our case, what we're interested here is object typicality. And for us, we want to say, we hypothesize that we will find higher naming variation when the object is less typical for the top name and more typical for the alternative name. Like this case here, there is much typicality for the tennis player, and we have higher variation. We have a similar, right, this is something that is already known. So from literature, what we know is that when an object is less typical for the top name, higher naming variation is found. This is the previous work result. For context, we have a similar hypothesis. So we think that this context, the tennis court, is very typical for the name tennis player, and this can elicit higher variation in the names because it's very typical for an alternative name. So we hypothesize that context typicality will be higher. No, sorry, naming variation will be higher when the context typicality for the top name will be lower and the context typicality for the alternative name will be higher. And finally, we're going to investigate the effect of lexical frequency. So if we look at the names here on the right, we see that tennis player is the name for which we say she's very typical, but in the end, the top name is woman. So we think that there is an effect here of lexical accessibility. So speaker access the name woman more easily. So there is a frequency effect as well. So we hypothesize that we will find higher naming variation when the frequency of the top name is lower and the frequency of the alternative name is higher. So we are going to build a regression model, as we were saying, that predicts variation with these predictors that we already mentioned. And to see the results, this is the image that visualizes them. So the first line shows what we have for the typicality, object typicality. And we can see that this is the result that was reported in literature. So higher variation is predicted for lower typicality for the top name. We add evidence for this with respect to the alternative name. So object typicality is higher when the typicality for the alternative name is, naming variation is higher when the object typicality for the alternative name is higher. We find a similar pattern for frequency, but this is not completely conclusive for the role of the alternative name because we can see that the confidence interval straddles 0 a bit. Instead, for context typicality, we don't really find an effect. So moving on. In general, what we have here is that we replicated previous findings about the top name typicality, and we have such evidence that suggests that top name and alternative name properties seem to work in opposite direction. We are sure about this for typicality, and we have some evidence for this for frequency, but it's not conclusive. So we speculate that what we are really seeing here is an effect of the competition between names. So when speakers have to name an object, there is a competition between the candidate names that takes place. And so when the competition is stronger because the object is typical for many different names, then we find more variation. And finally, there is the issue of context, why we don't find an effect. So one thing is how to represent a context. We could debate about this, and we chose a strategy that is, we run an object detector on the image, and we average the visual representations of the detected object that do not correspond to the target, of course. This strategy is something that we borrow from literature. So for example, these authors, Anderson and co-workers, used it for image captioning, that is the task of producing a caption for an image. So it's something that has been used in literature. That being said, one could still ask, are our proxies good? So besides the evidence from computer vision, we also ran a norming study, asking people to give a score for how typical a context was. So in this case, people were seeing a target object that was blurred, and this was the global scene, and the name appeared above. So they were asked to say how typical this scene was for an object named Blender. In this case, let's say low. And we see that our correlation between our computationally derived score and the human scores is 0.43. This is a nice positive correlation, and it's also nice with, for another aspect, that is that the average correlation between human annotators is 0.48. So this is a task that triggers in general some disagreement between humans. And so our computationally derived score is just as another human giving a score. They correlate with another human as much as another human would do. So the second question that one could ask is our strategy good? So we stopped our modeling strategies at this first alternative name, but actually maybe this is not enough to capture the effect of context. And this is the reason behind a further study that we did that is not presented in the paper today, but in further papers. And this is a spoiler then. So we try to model the competition that there is in place between more names than two. So what you're seeing here is a plot of object instances. So these are all the benches that we have in many names. And this is the prototype. So triangles are prototypes. And here we have chair, sofa, and couch. And it's nice also to see that, for example, the prototype of synonyms are very close. So our idea is that an image that is very close to bench does not have much competition because there is only one prototype that is a viable candidate. Instead, if an image is placed here, for example, there is some distance to chair, but is the same to sofa and to couch, the competition here is stronger. So we try to model the competition between all the prototypes in our space, capturing it with an index. And what we see is that there is an effect of context as well. So the effect of the index that captures the competition due to the visual feature is very strong. And the effect of the competition due to the context visual feature is there, but is less strong. This also makes sense because if we think about a case where an object can be called armchair and chair, of course, the visual features of the object are crucial to decide whether it's a chair or an armchair, but the context is really similar, is the same. So we see chairs and armchairs appearing in the same scenes. So we are convinced by this general pattern. And so in conclusion, what we say here is that we have shown that visual typicality and lexical availability, modeled through frequency, play an important role in naming variation. And we also say that computer vision representations can be a useful tool to inform our models of human object naming. And thank you.